Waiting. Oh,
And we're live. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 20 of the TechForge podcast. I'm your host for this session, Dynamo Ned, and I am joined this evening, evening when we record this, by Jason. Our co-host Hunter will be here as soon as he can get here. We are recording this episode a little early, given that we missed last week, and that this week, when we normally record, is the final beta session for the Fallout 76 beta, which I'm supposed to be streaming tomorrow. So you can guess when we're recording this. Regardless, we wanted to get kind of caught up after missing last week. And Hunter said he will join us as soon as he's able to come back from his previous engagement. So, I got a few things this week. Got some interesting tech news. The possibility that we could see 100 terabyte hard drives as soon as 2025. Intel has yet another vulnerability in their chips, and this one could affect AMD as well in the PortSmash vulnerability.
hyperthreading, right?
Yep, affects all SMT-enabled CPUs potentially.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also going to discuss AMD's Next Horizons event, or Next Horizon event, which took place yesterday when we're recording this, where we found out some very interesting new information about AMD's 7nm enterprise chips, in particular their EPYC Rome codename CPUs, as well as their new 7nm Vega Radeon Instinct MI60 and MI50 cards that they are positioning for compute.
Nice.
So let's get straight into the tech news. And first thing on the list here we have is from PC Games In. DRAM prices dropped 10% in 1 month, with DDR4 tumbling down toward Black Friday. So if you've been looking to build a PC anytime in the last couple of years, you know that there's been almost a shortage of DDR4 RAM. And the prices for DDR4 RAM, particularly when compared to their DDR3 predecessors, has been very high. Just as an example, I was able to purchase a 16 gigabyte kit of DDR4 2400. It was a Mushkin Razorback Elite, I think, for $65 in 2016. That same kit today is now almost double that price at $124.99, assuming you can find it. However, we have been seeing a trend downward in prices in the last month or so. PC Games In is basing this off information they got from DRAM Exchange. And based on their information they've received about the market, they believe that DRAM prices will continue to fall throughout the remainder of 2018 into the beginning of 2019.
Well, yeah, that's because there's mainly a pretty large surplus right now. So there was some press that came out recently about how Samsung is slowing production of DRAM because of, I don't remember if it was lower demand, but they do have a surplus right now. So,
right, which is the exact opposite of the situation we've had the last couple of years.
Right.
Of course, there were some accusations a couple months back, in particular coming from China, that Samsung, XK Hynix, and Micron were all intentionally limiting their production of DRAM to keep prices inflated at a high level. But it actually seems like it was simply a case of overly high demand and not nearly enough supply.
That could be. I remember there's also a class action lawsuit from a legal outfit out of California.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anything's come out of those investigations though.
Nothing that I've heard of in the tech press yet.
Mm.
So, Guru 3D took a look at prices on Amazon. In particular, they looked at Corsair LPX 8GB DDR4 DRAM over the last 3 months. And the particular kit they were looking at was $90 back at the beginning of August. But now, roughly 3 months later, it's down to $70.
That's pretty cool, man. Yeah, I just did a quick search on Newegg, and Trident Z3200 RAM is going for about $165 for a 16 gig kit. So
Yeah, and that's the very highest end stuff. Trident Z, especially if it's DDR4 3200,
mhm.
is almost the best you can get.
Yeah, well, it's widely adopted. It's pretty fast. You can overclock it pretty well. RGB, of course, and then I want to say that same kit was going for about 210 to 240 over the summer. So that's significantly cheaper. This is good. This is good to see. Hope it continues. It should not have been this high to begin with.
Yeah, it's been sad that for quite some time now, particularly for budget builders, the most expensive part you were likely to have in your PC was your RAM.
Right.
I mean, in all seriousness, I was looking to put together a very budget system recently.
Yeah.
And it was going to be like a Ryzen 3 2200G system for someone who's just looking for a basic office PC.
Oh, okay.
And, I was looking at about a $60 B3, B450 motherboard. The Ryzen 3 2200G is about $100. But for 8 gigs of DDR4 RAM, I was looking at almost as much as the Ryzen 3 2200G.
It's ridiculous. It should be $50, man.
Yeah, like I said, when I could get 16 gigs of DDR4 for literally $65 2 years ago, it's ridiculous now that we're actually starting to think, wow, $65 for an 8 gig kit is actually not that bad.
That's ridiculous. But it is what it is, right? So,
But hey, I'll take any relief we can get when it comes to DRAM prices.
absolutely.
And while SSDs in the storage world tend to get most of the fancy looks, and we actually have an SSD we're going to talk about in a little bit, Seagate is indicating that the hard drive manufacturing is not spooling down anytime soon. And in fact, earlier this week announced that they want to produce 100 terabyte hard drives by 2025.
That's crazy. Well, you're not going to see, as long as there's such a price difference between SSDs and hard drives per gigabyte. As long as that disparity exists, unless it's within a reasonable margin, you're always going to have hard drives. Always.
Right. And for archival storage, they're really hard to beat.
Mm-hmm. Well, you just get amazing capacity price points, right? So, I mean, what is it for a basic terabyte hard drive? It's like $50. You can get
45 to $50. Whereas a 1 terabyte SSD, even a budget 1 terabyte SSD, you're looking at the $150 range.
Right. Right. So, yeah, that's like a 300% difference, roughly.
Yeah, it's 3 times as much money.
Mm.
for the same capacity, even though it is much faster storage.
Right.
And so Seagate in particular was talking about this in light of their announcement of their HAMR technology, which stands for Heat Assisted Magnetic Recording. Now, this is a technology that they've discussed for a while now, but basically what HAMR does is that it uses little bursts of infrared energy to record ever smaller regions or sectors on the disk, which is how they've been able to fit larger and larger capacities in the same 3.5-inch form factor. And so right now, I think the biggest capacity Seagate makes is either 14 or 16 terabytes in a 3.5-inch form factor.
Wow.
And those drives right now cost something on the order of $500.
That's crazy.
But they're talking about having 50 terabyte hard drives early in the next decade, meaning in the 2020 area. So within the next couple of years.
Yeah. Well, I
And
imagine we'll see it pretty soon.
And they're thinking they're going to have 100 terabyte drives around 2025.
It seems like Seagate's usually making press regarding hard drive technology. It seems like whenever there's some big trend or some new technology for them for the hard drive industry to create or adopt, usually Seagate's like right on the forefront. I remember back when native command queuing was coming to market, Seagate seemed to be the first to adopt it. Perpendicular recording, Seagate. I also remember seeing helium being used, and again, that was Seagate. I know Western Digital is a a big time competitor of theirs in the hard drive industry, but I don't remember seeing Western Digital making headlines like that.
Well, Western Digital has introduced a competing technology to Seagate's HAMR with the slightly less memorably named MAMR for microwave assisted magnetic recording.
I'm not going to say what came to mind.
We'll leave that as an exercise to the viewer. But
it has to do with feeding babies.
Anyway, MAMR is apparently not going to be making its way to the consumer market, unlike HAMR. So, but it's the enterprise market where most of these higher capacity hard drives are going to find their homes anyway, because that's where you typically find the need for such high storage densities.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, it wouldn't surprise me to see some of these large hard drives eventually trickle down here into the consumer market. 4 terabyte drives are starting to really make their way into the consumer market. 2 terabyte has kind of become the standard because you can get 2 terabyte drives pretty much all day long in the $90 to $100 range, or cheaper if you don't mind 5400 RPM drives, which they're okay for archival storage, but not day-to-day use, in my opinion.
I want to say 2 terabyte prices have been kind of, at the same point for a while. At least a few years.
There's just not a whole lot of call for drives much larger than 2 terabytes, except in the enthusiast community and in the enterprise.
Yeah. Well, I'll be moving to 4 terabyte drives pretty soon here for archival, but that's going to be in an external hot swappable enclosure.
Right. So we can expect, I think, some new and interesting announcements from Seagate in the near future.
Sweet.
Speaking of new and interesting,
Mammer.
we talked about a couple of weeks ago that there were rumors about a Radeon RX 590 that have since been largely confirmed by AMD and have been even further confirmed by a leak that came out of Sapphire this week of a picture of their RX 590 Nitro Plus card. Now, for those who didn't see our previous episode about the RX 590, this is a 12 nanometer version of the Polaris GPU called Polaris 30. Previous iterations, Polaris 10 and Polaris 20, were based on the 14 nanometer process. So this will lead to an improvement of 10 to 15% in die area, as well as performance in general.
Mm-hmm.
And most likely, AMD is going to take advantage of that by cranking the clocks even further on Polaris 30 versus their current generation Polaris 20 on the RX 580. It's still going to have the same 2,304 streaming processor cores and 8 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory.
Yeah, it's going to have the same front and back end, and it's just going to be a higher clock part because they've gone to a different process. But I mean, as some might say, this is a bona fide upgrade. I mean, you're looking at 10 to 15% performance, right? So that's not a bad looking card, honestly.
Yep, and I'm going to show the card here for everybody. So here's the card right here. Notice it has that Sapphire's signature look here on the shroud, but unlike their previous Nitro Plus cards, which typically had a gray shroud, this has an actual sapphire shroud. And here's a more up-close video or up-close photo. These are coming from Video Card Z, although this particular article is WCCF Tech.
Oh, it's powered by an 8 and a 6-pin connector, huh? Wow.
And it also has a backplate that looks like this.
Wow, that's a nice looking backplate, man.
Yeah, I do like it. So,
not too crazy about the color scheme, but
in the right build, it'd look okay if you were going for a white color scheme.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
You know, a white and blue. If you had some of the older generation Gigabyte boards when they used those powder blue, sky blue PCBs.
Oh my gosh, man. You're going far.
Not that far. I still have a Gigabyte A75 UD4H that used that powder blue PCB. Of course, that was with an A8 3870K APU. Admittedly, it's about 5 years ago, but
yeah,
5 or 6 years ago at this point. But there was a while there in the early 2010s where Gigabyte, all but their highest end boards, had that baby blue PCB that would have fit perfect with that card.
Nice. I'm kind of looking forward to seeing, seeing reviews, benchmarks, power consumption. I'm thinking it's going to be a 200 watt TDP or a 200 watt card.
Probably. I mean, the original Polaris was something like 150, 175 watt.
Yeah.
For the RX 480.
Sounds about right.
And then the RX 580, since it was basically overclocked version of the RX 480, I think it was closer to like 185, 190 watt. So a 200 watt card, especially if they decide to crank the clocks, it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. Which, I mean, honestly, that's actually a pretty efficient card when you think about it. I mean, what GTX 770s were consuming like 250, I want to say, right around there, 225, 250.
As a person who owned a GTX 770, yeah, nominally they were a 230-watt card, but you could easily, with a slight overclock, push them up to 270 or so.
And they say Vega is bad. That's a typical Vega workload for me, man. Honestly.
And the truth of the matter is, the GTX 770 these days is roughly comparable in performance to a GTX 1050 Ti.
Yeah. Yep. And that's, oh my gosh, what is that? That runs
That's
doesn't that run off the PCIe? Or
It's technically a 65-watt card.
okay.
It can be up to 73 if you have one of the models that comes with a 6-pin connector. But
Gotcha.
all right. So, okay. So this next bit, it's actually, I picked this particular article because it kind of covers two things at the same time that are kind of interrelated. And the first is that if you were interested in getting yourself a GTX 1080 Ti, you need to go ahead and do it now because the stock, well, the back stock is almost gone.
Yep, and prices are increasing.
It's been fairly slow so far, but if you want yourself a new GTX 1080 Ti, you need to either buy it now or be willing to purchase off the used market.
Yep.
Because prices are slowly creeping upward as stock begins to dwindle.
Which means Pascal supply will be going the way of the dodo eventually here. I don't
And
know more supply they've got, but
I mean, we knew that NVIDIA had ceased production on those cards quite a while ago.
yeah.
And they did have a huge surplus of those cards left over. But they sent almost all of them to their AIB partners, which is why we've seen the dip in prices of late in those cards. Not to mention the RTX cards also contributed to that price drop. And speaking of those RTX cards,
Okay.
there has been a rash of dead 2080 Ti's.
Oh yeah, I've seen some press on this.
Yes. So this is part of the reason I linked to this particular Gamers Nexus article, because they cover both of these in the same one. And so apparently there has been a large number of people, or larger than normal. Well, let me rephrase that. There has been a significant number of people who have reported the RTX 2080 Ti either crashing to desktop in games, locking up with a blue screen of death, or just outright stop working, along with a number of other issues. A lot of these seem to be driver related, and Gamers Nexus in particular put out a Reddit thread where they asked people to send their dead RTX 2080s and 2080 Ti's to them specifically to find out what was causing the issue. There was an article from Digital Trends which initially pointed to possibly the issue being some of the GDDR5 dies, or GDDR6, excuse me, dies on the RTX 2080 Ti possibly overheating. That has not been confirmed as of yet, but the problems seem to be concentrated with either Founder Edition RTX 2080 Ti's or add-in board partner cards that use the reference 2080 Ti PCB.
Yeah, because when you do a PCB breakdown of the reference PCB, there's one or two, maybe three of those DDR6 chips that are either right on top of the power delivery, the VRM or the MOSFET, or they're dangerously close. So I could see that being a potential problem because I would have to suspect I mean, those cards are cranking a lot of juice, man, or they're requiring a lot of power. So those VRMs and those MOSFETs and stuff, those things get really toasty.
That they do.
And I don't know why you would put DDR6 so close to, some power delivery on a PCB like that. Because those cards are consuming 300 watts, easy.
Unless you don't have any other option.
I don't know. The reference designs are like 11, I want to say right around 11 inches long. So that's a lot of real estate, man.
I mean, I agree, but do take into account the Turing die is a huge monolithic die for a GPU.
Yeah.
And it could be that to give it its proper amount of space, they had to cut some corners somewhere.
Well, $1,300, $1,400, $1,200.
Yeah, it really shouldn't be an issue.
Right.
But in all fairness, I do want to mention that just before we went to record, Gamers Nexus actually put up 2 new videos about this very issue, where they were able to figure out one of the problems that was causing the blue screens of death was in fact a driver-related issue that only happens with certain monitors.
Really? And so if you have a certain monitor, then it bricks your card?
Well, not so much that, but you get one of those infamous IRQL less than or not equal errors.
Okay, so your card's not bricked. You just maybe change a driver variant or change a monitor. I don't know. That's kind of crazy.
And so Gamers Nexus has made NVIDIA aware, and NVIDIA apparently says they're going to attempt to fix that in the next driver update. In the meantime, there are still other issues, some of them heat-related, some of them crashed desktop-related.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, they talk about with one particular sample of RTX 2080 Ti they've received. They've received about 5 so far, apparently, from people sending them in who are having issues with their cards. There was one that they were able to reproduce it every time. Apparently, it is a particular sequence in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where every time they're able to reproduce a crash to desktop. They initially thought it was an issue with the driver for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but they've updated to the latest one, which is supposed to fix all those issues, and they still are getting the same crash to desktop. So,
well, it's probably going to take. I'm sure they fixed some stuff with that driver release, but it's probably going to take some testing and to further iron out the bugs.
Well, and like I said, they just gotten these cards from viewers who are having issues with them, and they're still in the testing phase. This is just some of the preliminary results they've determined from testing these quote-unquote dead cards.
Mm-hmm.
One of them, they were able to determine it was indeed a hardware failure. The exact nature of that hardware failure, they don't know, but the card just would not even turn on.
Wow.
And so the others seem to be either driver related or those blue screen of death, crash to desktop issues. They've not determined whether all of those are driver related or if they are in fact related to the overheating problem that Tom's Hardware and Digital Trends pointed toward.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still a little up in the air. Regardless, the RTX 2080 Ti, NVIDIA says that the rate of failure that they're seeing from their users is not any higher than they've seen in the past with other cards. This could just be a a visibility issue where, given that this is a relatively small pool of people, that the issues that are being seen with this card are just more visible.
I'm sure that's the majority of the case. I mean, they've already not been well received, from a perception basis. So any press that, says where there's a bad batch or two of cards is really going to come to the limelight and make headlines. So, yeah. Still, I couldn't imagine being one of those users that spent like $1,300 on a 2080 Ti just to have it die in like a month or two, or
Yeah,
not
that
even work properly out of the box. So
yeah, that I mean, admittedly, whenever we buy hardware, that's the kind of crapshoot we're really taking.
that's
But
very true. That's very true.
but it has to hurt so much worse for a $1,200 to $1,500 card than it does for $150 to $200 card.
Yeah, if I've got a $200 video card that just didn't work out of the box, I'd be a little angry. But okay, no problem. I'll either return it and get another one, or RMA it and get it back in 2 to 3 weeks.
Whereas if I've bought my brand new RTX 2080 Ti for $1,200, go to pop it in and nothing happens.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I mean, it's still RMA it and get it back in 2 to 3 weeks, but what do you do in that 2 to 3 weeks?
Well, use your previous card, I guess, or if you're a first-time builder, gotta kind of wait.
Or if you're the type of builder who sells their old card to finance their new one.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I have a rant.
Okay.
And we can approach this after. But I was at Best Buy today, and it's the third or fourth time I've seen it, and it drives me bonkers. We can wait.
Okay.
But this drives me nuts.
No, you've got me intrigued now. Let's hear it.
So, have you ever gone to Best Buy and just kind of, browsed the gaming desktops that they offer?
I have.
So they'll have like a couple of iBuyPowers, maybe an HP, maybe one or two other brands. So I'm looking at this from an enthusiast perspective, right? And somebody that builds the occasional system and sells it, or builds one for a friend, you know what I mean? And I see the same things. Like, okay, flashy looking case, nice keyboard, nice mouse, right? But when you look inside of it, you see either a stock Intel cooler on the CPU, or something that is comparable, or worse. On top of that, one stick of RAM.
Yes.
One stick of RAM. All right. Now I can get past an $800 or $900 machine with having a 2 gigabyte 1050. Okay, whatever. Or having an H310 motherboard, or having a really low end i5. Fine, I can get past that. But gimping the machine out of the box with one stick of RAM, seriously? No.
Well, a lot. And it's even worse if you're looking at an AMD Ryzen machine, because with their Infinity Fabric interconnect, it's so dependent on memory bandwidth.
Exactly. And they're probably putting in like, 2133 or 2400 megahertz RAM. So, and a single memory chip.
Right, because capacity is the only thing that matters, right?
I wanted to ask the salesperson there why, but then it dawned on me this guy is just working, 10 to 15 an hour, and he's an enthusiast, most likely, like I am. So he probably doesn't know, but I just don't understand sometimes. I just don't understand.
Well, the thing I have to remember whenever I look at pre-built is this. The company that built this wanted to achieve a particular set of specs as cheaply as possible for the lowest bill of materials possible.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So we'll stick with one DIMM and label it a gaming machine.
Yeah, the disparity that you typically see with some of that hardware is just insane. When you have, an i7 or an i9 machine or a Ryzen 7 machine, and they pair it with an entry-level graphics card, that's the thing that boggles my mind.
Yeah.
It's like, you realize all you've done is you've made it really, really good at anything but gaming.
Right. And I'm constantly telling people you're not going to save money if you build your own machine. And then I take my cousin and I take a trip down to Micro Center, and for $960, he gets Ryzen 5 2600X stock cooler, a really nice X470 board, not like a $200 or $300 one, but it's on Newegg. It's probably around 180, 170 somewhere there, but it's nice, especially for what he's putting in it. 16 gigs of Trident Z memory, an RX 580 8 gig card, an SSD and a hard drive, and a Meshify C case for $960, which includes tax. Granted, Windows isn't factored in there, but still. And then I go to Best Buy and I see similarly priced machines, but it's the lower end i5 8000 series Q H310 motherboard, one stick of RAM. I want to say it was right around 8 gigs maybe, and with a GTX 1050. And a slightly bigger case, and it had a similar storage setup that my cousins had, but still that Ryzen 5 system he built for the same money would run circles around that, no problem. I don't understand it. I don't know. That's my rant. I'm done.
Well, speaking of ranting about hardware choices, Intel was aware of the upcoming AMD Next Horizon event, and so late last week, they attempted to beat AMD to the punch. On November 4th, they announced 2 new members of their Intel Xeon processor portfolio. Their Cascade Lake Advanced Performance line, which was due to be released in the first half of 2019, and their Xeon E2100 line for entry-level servers, available today, that being November 4th when it was published. So Cascade Lake is probably the more interesting of the two, in that apparently what Intel has decided to do is to take their Skylake X CPUs, or excuse me, their Skylake EP CPUs that they were using in the server space, and essentially glue 2 of the same dies on the same PCB to create Cascade Lake.
How do they communicate? Through
It's
the
not
radio?
been made entirely clear. What we do know is that Intel is claiming up to 48 cores on a single socket.
Okay.
And they are claiming that in LinPack, it has up to 1.21 times the speed or the performance of the Xeon 8180, which would have been its predecessor at 28 cores and 56 threads, and 3.4 times AMD EPYC 7601, which was the 32-core EPYC processor.
Hmm. That's fine.
But the key thing is that if you look at the configuration details for that particular benchmark, they have SMT turned off for both of those processors. Which, admittedly, with LinPack, apparently it is recommended to turn SMT off for that particular test, so it's not that odd. But it is odd that you'd compare a 48-core processor with a 28-core with hyperthreading turned off and a 32-core 64-thread with hyperthreading turned off. And if it was just that benchmark, it wouldn't be that odd. Except they also turned up SMT for the other tests they did as well.
So I'm trying. Still, the Intel processor that they're benchmarking, there's still a disparity there in number of cores.
Right.
Right. But when the EPYC line comes out, they're going to have EPYCs that have up to 64 cores on the same socket.
Right.
So, okay, it's nice, I guess. I'm trying to find context here.
So let me read directly from their press release. Quote, the processor incorporates a performance-optimized multi-chip package to deliver up to 48 cores per CPU and 12 DDR4 memory channels per socket.
Hmm.
In addition, Cascade Lake advanced performance processors are expected to continue Intel's focus on offering workload-optimized performance leadership by delivering both core CPU performance gains and leadership in memory bandwidth-constrained workloads. But notice the fact that it's up to 12 DDR4 memory channels per socket. In other words, they're going for hexa-channel memory.
Well, I don't know enough about these data center platforms, honestly, or these enterprise platforms.
Well, there was, if you watch, I've mentioned Adored TV on this podcast before, but he had an excellent analysis video several months back where he was talking about how Intel was having trouble moving forward. But he did a follow-up video recently based on this information that was released, and he pointed out, and the reason I called out the SMT being turned off is there's no talk about SMT on these advanced Cascade Lake processors. Intel is only touting them as 48 cores per CPU. Notice they don't talk anything about hyperthreading.
Well, I want to say that SMT is more efficient than hyperthreading when you're comparing Skylake versus current Zen architecture. So maybe that's the reason. Maybe that's also the reason that they've chosen benchmarks which suggest to have SMT and hyperthreading disabled for your testing methodology.
Perhaps, but there's also the other possibility that maybe these processors don't have SMT enabled at all.
That could be. I don't know.
Because if we're looking at two based on the fact that they're saying it is multi-chip technology on the same socket, is indicative that they're doing something where they are putting multiple dies on the same chip.
I don't understand why you wouldn't have hyper-threading or SMT for enterprise level platforms. That just doesn't make sense to me, because essentially you're doubling the number of threads that each core can work on.
Well, I would tend to agree, but consider if you have 48 cores on the same die, basically two 24-core Xeons glued onto the same die.
Sure.
And you want to keep heat manageable. What's one of the easiest ways to do that?
Disable SMT/hyperthreading.
Mm-hmm.
Or clock speed. Or both.
Exactly.
I would
if you want to
clock speed management, honestly. But good.
But yeah, I remember the bad old days of the Pentium 4 with hyperthreading. I owned a couple of them. And I remember the last time Intel did something like this. And it was, I'd had the Pentium 4 with hyperthreading.
Mm-hmm.
It was I believe it was Prescott, if I remember right. Prescott core, 3.4 gigahertz. I believe it was the Pentium 4 630, 631, something like that.
Oh, wow.
That thing idled at 45 degrees C.
That is scary. That is scary.
And then came down the line the Pentium D. I had a Pentium D. A Pentium D 915 was the entry-level Pentium D. Do you want to know what the Pentium D was?
Oh, I know exactly what it was. It's just like this. They basically took two Pentium 4 dies and glued them on, but they communicated through the front side bus.
Exactly.
So in lots of workloads, it was very inefficient, especially when there were a lot of accesses to memory, either read or write. And they were trying to access, both cores or whatever, going back and forth between cores. But yep.
But yeah, that chip also idled at 45C. However, on the stock cooler, when put under load, it regularly hit 85, 86C. And I'm not talking about strenuous workloads. I'm talking about normal everyday workloads.
Right.
And that system gave me more trouble with that Pentium D. I upgraded it to the biggest cooler I could find. That knocked down the temperatures about 5 degrees Celsius, which helped. I put it in as big a case as I could afford. I put as much airflow through it as I could.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, it was not heat or anything else that got that system. It was lightning. We had a lightning strike very close to our house. It ran in through the house. It came through the phone line, if I remember right, which was plugged into the PC because we had dial-up internet at the time, and fried the entire thing. That was after it blew up our surge protector, but
oh, tonight is the night for words. Mammer
yes.
And blew up. Blew up and mammer. Mammer.
All right. So Intel is trying to put out something out there to fight with AMD's new processors that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But, well, AMD, Intel, as well as Samsung and Crucial are facing new threats security-wise. And so I wanted to introduce a new segment here to the show, and that is Security Watch. For specifically specifically because we tend to see issues like this pop up from time to time. And while they're not directly tech related, they are related in the sense that these are things our audience needs to know about. And so, first up in Security Watch this week, Crucial in Samsung. This comes from Tom's Hardware. Crucial in Samsung SSDs, encryption is easily bypassed. And so, researchers at Radboud University in the Netherlands reported today that they discovered a way that hackers could easily bypass the encryption on Crucial and Samsung SSDs without the user's passwords.
Talk about scary time.
They were able to reverse engineer the firmware of multiple drives and found a pattern of critical issues. In one case, they were able to decrypt data using just an empty string. In another, they said the drive could be unlocked with any password because the drive's password validation check simply didn't work. So, in particular, the drives that they found with these issues were Crucial's MX100, 200, and 300 SSDs, Samsung's T3 and T5 portable SSDs, and the ever-popular 840 EVO and 850 EVO SSDs from Samsung.
So that's scary because I've got an 850 EVO as my OS drive. So
they admit, though, that Microsoft's BitLocker software is partly to blame. In particular, they say that Microsoft shares some of the blame for Windows user data that can be easily stolen from their encrypted drives by people with access to the user's laptops because it uses the drive's own encryption by default instead of its own.
Oh my gosh. You know you said Windows, right?
I did?
Yeah. You said Windows.
It's just my southern accent creeping in.
Mm-hmm. Y'all.
So anyway, with Windows, the issue being that the drive's inbuilt encryption systems, which they found were fundamentally flawed, since they're used by default instead of BitLocker's own encryption algorithms, well, let's put it this way. Cryptography professor Matthew Green called Microsoft's decision to trust device makers' own encryption schemes over their own, quote, the single dumbest thing that company has ever done.
That's a pretty strong statement. That's funny, though.
And so the researchers recommended instead that users use the open-sourced and audited VeraCrypt software for drive encryption. As VeraCrypt uses its own algorithms by default, it is open source and well audited, so it is known to be secure. And that, in general, that you should not use the encryption acceleration offered by SSDs, as given the current AES-NI encryption standard, that encryption acceleration algorithm is fast enough as it is.
We shall see.
So, just to be aware, some of the most popular SSDs out there from Samsung and Crucial, this affects me too because I have a Crucial MX200. Of course, this is only really an issue if you actually have your drives encrypted, which you kind of should if you have any sensitive data on them. But on the other hand, most consumers I know don't run encryption on their drives.
I don't.
So the drive will continue to function normally if you do not encrypt your drive, but just know that if you do encrypt on the drive, that it may not be as secure as you think it is. So on to the other security vulnerability to talk about this week, and that is the new PortSmash exploit. So Intel recently announced that their 9th gen processors would include mitigations for the previously detected Spectre and Meltdown issues. And that some of these mitigations unfortunately come at the cost of performance. However, there's a brand new vulnerability. This one, yet another side channel vulnerability called PortSmash.
That's a great name. That's such a great name. PortSmash.
So what PortSmash does is that it takes advantage of simultaneous multi-threading technology on the processor, which allows the nefarious code to run alongside a legitimate thread. Quote, PortSmash processes then leak small amounts of data from the legitimate process, helping an attacker reconstruct the encrypted data processed inside the legitimate process.
That's a lot of process.
And so this is not the first time such an attack vector has been identified, though. There was a previous Intel SMT bug labeled TL Bleed that had much the same issue. And so the team that found this was a team of Finnish and Cuban researchers working out of the Tampere University of Technology and the Technical University of Havana. They were able to confirm that hyperthread-enabled Skylake and Kaby Lake processors were susceptible to this exploit. They have not been able to confirm it with Coffee Lake or the Coffee Lake refresh. They say, quote, the nature of the leak is due to execution engine sharing in SMT architectures. More specifically, we detect port contention to construct a timing side channel to exfiltrate information from processes running in parallel on the same physical core. For those of you who do not speak computer engineer, what that means is that they specifically slam the processor on the same port with multiple processes in the attempt to use this nefarious process as a way to grab information from the legitimate one.
Sounds like a brute force type of technique. If they're overloading it, that does sound like a brute force.
Well, it's not so much brute force as it is, it's utilizing the fact that SMT can run processes in parallel, but the nefarious process, the two processes are not supposed to interact with SMT. But as an execution optimization, Intel has included what's called execution engine sharing, which means if two processes utilize the same information, then rather than maintaining two separate copies of that information, it can utilize the same one. At this time, it's not been proven whether this would also affect SMT on AMD processors. Professor Brumley and his team have not yet tested Zen-based processors from AMD.
It looks like they've got a proof of concept on GitHub, though.
For Skylake and Kaby Lake, yes. But they believe it is highly likely that AMD Ryzen processors will also be affected. So
I'm sure they'll get around to testing it.
So Intel did respond to the issue by stating that it is not related to speculative execution, and so it's not related to Spectre or Meltdown. And they suspect that such side channel analysis methods would work regardless of hardware involved.
Mm.
So,
Still just
PortSmash
theory,
could be coming to your processor very soon.
though. It's still theory, though.
So far, although again, there is a proof of concept on 6th and 7th generation Intel Core processors.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of new processors, that brings us to the big topic for the show this evening, which is AMD's Next Horizon event. Now, I've included a link in the links down below in the description, if you're watching this later, to the entire 2-hour-long AMD Next Horizon event video. It's worth the watch. It's some very fascinating stuff that they show off. But obviously, we don't want to spend 2 hours here going through the entire thing.
Yeah.
So I've also included links to a couple of summary articles, one from TechSpot and another from Tom's Hardware, where they talk about the major things that were discussed, as well as a link to AMD's own official website for the Next Horizon event, where you can actually download the slide decks and all the videos that they have from their partners, which
Nice.
the partners that they brought for this particular conference are pretty big ones. TSMC, of course, they already partner with them on 7 nanometer to build this stuff. VMware as a partner, as a testimonial to how AMD EPYC processors work in a VMware environment. Dell EMC, which is Dell's enterprise division. And Cisco, talking about as a customer of AMD's EPYC, what that means for their work as well. So some really big names in the enterprise game there.
Nice. That's something. So I'm kind of reading through the article, but that's something I failed to see when I was watching the YouTube video of the press event. The fact that they are moving to a modular design, which I guess they had kind of a semi-modular design already, but the Infinity Fabric will be 14 nanometer, which includes the memory controller, the I/O, and then the actual CPU dies will be 7 nanometer. That's interesting. There's some definite big takeaways from this on the consumer level that we should expect to see. They've heavily beefed up their front end. So, branch prediction, prefetch, all of that stuff is getting major, major upgrades. So, on top of the on top of the performance upgrade you'll get just from going to 7 nanometer in terms of performance with heat and faster clock speeds, you're getting some major, major architectural improvements. So this is pretty exciting, actually. This means that they can have a bit more flexibility in their product stacks now. This is pretty cool.
Yeah, they highlighted in particular their EPYC Rome CPU, Rome being the code name. Remember, the original Zen CPU for EPYC was called Naples. And so Rome is going to be a 64-core, 128-thread design that supports the PCIe 4.0 standard.
Mm-hmm.
And they are claiming a 4 times improvement in floating point unit performance.
Well, that's because they're also beefing up their back-end floating point unit. I want to say they're going from 128 to 512.
That wouldn't surprise me. Given in particular Intel's proclivity to point out their AVX 512 instructions to show their superior performance.
In AVX.
Well, for AMD to be able to execute those same instructions of AVX 512 without having to emulate it would be a big performance boon. They also say that given their partnership with TSMC, they've been able to double the transistor density, half the power consumption at the same performance as the previous generation, and achieve 25% greater performance at the same power envelope as the previous generation.
That's extremely impressive.
So,
that's very impressive.
So, for reference, if you take a first-gen Ryzen chip running at 4.0 gigahertz, which is pretty common for their high-end Ryzen 7, say the 1800X. That means if they're operating at 25% greater performance at the same power envelope, that we could be looking at anywhere from 4.6 to 5 gigahertz at the same 95 watt TDP as the Ryzen 7 1800X.
I'd say a boost to 4.6 would be pretty conservative. 1 or 2 core at 5, I would think it would be possible at 7 nanometer.
Well, the 4.6 number I'm getting from the fact that the base clock of the 1800X is 3.6 gigahertz.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have a 25% improvement over that, that's an additional 900 megahertz, which is actually about 4.5 gigahertz. And so if you go with the higher number of 4 gigahertz, 25% performance increase there, of course, is a whole gigahertz, which is 5 gigahertz, which why I say 4.5 to 5 gigahertz.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see. I don't know. I could see, honestly, I would be happy with a 1 or 2 core boost at 5, honestly. But if they can beat that, oof, along with all of the other architectural improvements they're making here, wow. Wow.
I was going to say, well, let's consider this. I don't remember offhand, but what's the clock speed of, say, the Threadripper 2990WX? Isn't it like base 3.0 gigahertz?
Yep. Boost 4.
Okay. So base 3 gigahertz, 32 core processor. If we assume a 25% performance improvement over 3 gigahertz, 25% is roughly 750 megahertz. So that's base 3.7 gigahertz, 3.75 gigahertz, which that puts it right there in
base.
Yeah, in base at 3.75 gigahertz. And again, if it's 25% off the top at 4 gigahertz, again, you're talking about 4.5 to 5 gigahertz range.
Yeah. And you know those processors still use precision boost and XFR. So they're looking at any way they can increase in clock speed in any workload. So they're probably sitting around 4 gigahertz anyway under normal usage. Most people run those on water anyway.
And of course, as we talked about before, this is AMD moving away from monolithic design. You know, they had kind of the semi-modular design with Threadripper, where you had the 4 separate dies on the same chip with the Infinity Fabric interconnect. With EPYC Rome, they're moving to a 14 nanometer I/O die, which is going to handle basically all the memory controller features, coupled with 8 7 nanometer chiplets, which have all the CPU cores.
Yeah, there's a picture there of Lisa holding up, Lisa Su, the CEO of AMD, holding up an EPYC processor without the heat spreader. And you can clearly see the Infinity fabric in the middle and then the chiplets on the outer edge, the 4 chiplets there. That's a very impressive design, honestly.
I was going to see if I could get a clear photo for our audience to take a look at. Here we go. So this is a super close-up from a non-tech. Let me get this shared here.
Sweet.
Okay, so this is a super close-up of the EPYC die. And as you can see, you have the huge 14 nanometer I/O die in the center, and then each of the Zen 2 dies, and there's 8 of them around the center I/O die. What this does is it grants uniform memory access to all the chiplets. You know, the big problem that the 2990WX had on Threadripper was that there were only certain dies that were directly connected to the memory. And so that introduced a latency penalty. Well, with this, because everything's having to go through the I/O die, everything has the exact same latency in accessing the memory.
Which effectively fixes the design, the design flaw that they had.
Right. Here's another view with a slightly different reflection on it.
So shiny. Which means it's I don't know if realistic's the right word, but we very well could see a 48 core Threadripper.
It would not surprise me to see the next generation of Threadripper include a much higher core count.
I said 48, I was thinking Intel. 64.
Yeah. It wouldn't surprise me if you had a 48 core as well, because...
That's true. They do have a 12 core variant, so 12
and a 24 core.
Yeah. Huh? And
so,
now that they fixed the design, pretty awesome stuff.
Of course, EPYC CPUs were not the only 7 nanometer design announced at Next Horizon. There was also the fact that they announced their first 7 nanometer GPUs.
Vega 20.
And so these are the rumored Vega 20 GPUs. Of course, they are marketing them first under their Radeon Instinct branding, which is their compute line.
Well, they're strong in compute, so they're going to leverage the strengths of the architecture.
Basically, there are 2 variants being offered, the Instinct MI60 and the Instinct MI50. The MI60 offers 64 compute units with 4,096 stream processors. Gosh, that sounds awful familiar. Whereas the MI50 offers 60 compute units with 3,840 stream processors. The MI60 will have 32 gigabytes of HBM2 memory, whereas the MI50 only has 16 gigabytes of HBM2 memory.
So the MI50 is at FP32 performance parity with the Titan. The MI60 surpasses it. That's extremely impressive.
The Titan XP or the Titan V?
V. Titan V, I think, is right around 13.5 teraflops for FP32 performance. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's right around where it is. So
you can check real quick. Titan V FP32 performance. NVIDIA claims that the Titan V produces around 15 teraflops of FP32.
okay.
But still, not that big a difference.
No. Which means the MI60 is almost at parity.
Right. It wouldn't surprise me, though, to find out that, say, the Titan XP was right around that 13 teraflops, though.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll see consumer end cards with this architecture or not.
I mean, I really hope we do. Because can you imagine Vega 64, but at half its current power usage?
That'd be pretty outstanding.
Because that's what they're claiming about their 7-nanometer process, is that they can get double the density
For half the power consumption.
Exactly.
Well, and that's all pretty much coming from the process shrink. I mean, if they're not making any architectural improvements, that's all process node right there. Moving from 14 to well, wait a second. Isn't current Vega 12?
No, current Vega is 14 nanometer.
Is it?
It's supposed to be.
Yeah, you're right.
So if this die shrink is letting them, bring Vega down to a power target more in line with what people expect in a high-end consumer GPU, I was going to say Vega 64 was running what, close to 400 watts, I think.
Depends on which one you get. If you get the base variant that's air cooled, it's right around a 295 watt TDP. If you get the liquid cooled variant, which runs at more aggressive clock speeds, that's a 350 watt TDP.
Okay, so
Right around there.
If you were to cut that in half, imagine a Vega 64 at 175 watt TDP.
That's crazy.
Wow.
Wow.
Now, admittedly, we've seen a lot of things where TDP doesn't mean nearly as much as it used to.
Well, if you're looking at CPUs, yeah, but I can't completely fault Intel for that because there's some press coming out where a lot of the motherboard manufacturers for the Z390 chipsets and even the Z370s aren't paying attention to Intel's recommendations for their power states.
Right. They're running the CPUs well outside of the spec.
Yeah.
In order to make sure that their board is the fastest.
Yeah. And in some workloads, it's consuming up to 250 watts of power. And it's generating a lot of heat.
Yeah, and that's really concerning.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're looking at that's probably beyond. I want to say, what is a decent 240 AIO? What can that do? I want to say right around
200 watts.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe three. Maybe three. I don't know.
I was going to say, I remember a time when a solid 120 or 140 millimeter air cooler. I remember this because I had an NZXT Havoc 120, and its marketing materials was that can dissipate up to 240 watts TDP,
which is at the time was an overclocked FX.
Right.
So, but honestly, I never would have trusted a good 120 or 140 watt, heatsink on my overclocked 8320. That's why I went with a double 120 tower
Right.
NHD 14.
Right.
And it was perfectly fine with that monster cooler on there.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've got a 360 AIO, and I will never have to worry about my 2700X temps ever.
This is true.
I want to say a 240 could probably take care of it, like a nice 240. But still, you're looking at 95 watt TDP. Okay. There might be some workloads. If I push it a bit, it goes up to 120, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But not 250 watts, man.
Right. I mean, I remember...
Stock. You're not overclocking it.
I remember when AMD had to market the Phenom 2 X6 1090T as a 125 watt part, even though it didn't really consume that much more power than the 1055T that I used. That was a 95 watt part. But when you overclocked it, yeah, it would push up to 150, 160 watts.
Well, most enthusiasts would expect that if they're overclocking, because you're running it out of spec. So remember when the superclocked FXs came out? They only worked on a handful of motherboards because they
yes,
very special VRMs.
Yes, because
they were 220 watt TDP parts, man.
Yes, those were the ones that came bundled with their own liquid coolers, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and they still weren't sufficient.
Yep. Because a 120 AIO is just not enough for a 220 watt CPU.
No, especially when you're trying to overclock it. And it's no faster in gaming workloads than a Core i3. Interesting.
But man, it could shred some of those rendering tasks at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and it could put your space heater to shame too.
Exactly.
I shouldn't say that. I really did enjoy my 8320. I kind of miss it sometimes, but
I mean, they were solid chips for what they did.
Yeah, they were stable, solid.
If you needed an entry-level workstation that you could also game on occasion, then yeah, they were great for that.
And they were cheap.
They were cheap. I recommended many an FX 6300 build to people who are looking to build a CPU or build a PC for around $600. Because at that price point, you couldn't beat it.
Yeah, you got good gaming performance. I mean, well, the FX 6000 series parts were going for 90 to 115, somewhere in there.
Yep.
I want to say. Yeah, for that price point, you really can't beat it.
Speaking of price points, we do have a couple of hardware deals this week. I looked around the internet a bit, and I found a couple of decent deals. The first one is for a graphics card. I still maintain that the RX 574 gig is the best deal in graphics cards right now, considering that you can get one for right around $150 USD and also get $120 worth of games for free with it. That said, I realize not everyone likes Team Red. So this week, I specifically went out to find a good deal on an NVIDIA card. And I did find a pretty decent one. You can get a Gigabyte GeForce GTX 1060. It's the 3 gig model, but it's still a solid card. It's their double fan model. So it is factory overclocked to 1582 megahertz base and 1797 megahertz boost. And it is on sale right now at Newegg for $169.99 after a $20 mail-in rebate.
That is not a bad price.
Like I said,
I'd rather have the 4 gig frame buffer, but
yeah, like I said, if you'd rather have something from Team Green, this is a solid option in that same price range.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for some moderately fast storage at a good price, I'd like to recommend also from Newegg, the ADATA SU650 480 gig SSD. This is a 2.5-inch SSD that is SATA 3. The read-write speeds are not the fastest in the world. 520 read, 450 write. And that's for sequential reads and writes. So again, not the fastest drive out there. But it comes in at a very budget-friendly $65 for 480 gigabytes.
Yeah, 480 gig SSD. And that product SKU has been out for several years. And it's a very reliable SKU.
Indeed.
You can't beat that price, man. $65 for 480 gigabytes. Yeah, that's a no-brainer, man.
Yeah, so if you're looking for it's not going to be the fastest OS drive, but if you have a budget system or you have an older system that you really want to improve the speed of without a whole lot of other tinkering, moving your operating system over to a SSD, even if it's a SATA SSD rather than an NVMe one, is one of the easiest and best ways to improve the responsiveness and speed of your system.
By several factors. Yeah.
You know, the old advice used to be, oh, your system's running slow, just get more RAM. No. Moving from a hard drive to an SSD will make your system far more responsive than just adding more RAM.
Yeah.
As a general rule.
Well, it's probably the most highly recommended upgrade anyone can get for their system. And with SSDs just falling in price like they are. I mean, if all you do is just browse, just do some very typical office type workloads with spreadsheets, documents, occasional photos, a 256 gig drive is more than enough storage for that kind of use. And those have come down right around $40, $30. So, if you've got like a 2 or 3 or even a brand new, budget laptop, you stick that thing in there and it's just gonna sing, man.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, if you need more storage than what's on that SSD, you can get a hard drive at a similar price that'll give you 1 to 2 terabytes of storage.
Mm-hmm. For about $50-$60.
Yep. So, with that said, that brings us to the end of our show for this week. Jason, I'd like to thank you for joining me this evening. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Thanks, Ned. It's been a lot of fun. The only other thing I'd like to add is, uh, and we were kind of talking about it before the show, and I don't know if we covered it or not. Yeah, we did. Um, Keep expecting prices on DRAM and SSDs to fall. A lot of analysts are projecting SSD prices to continue to fall throughout the year, throughout 2019. And so far, all of the trends that we have been seeing since June uh, are reflecting that. If prices continue to fall like they are this time next year, 1 terabyte SSDs will be right around $70. So it's going to be awesome, dude. 2019 is going to be a big year, man.
Yep, it is sounding like it is shaping up that way, most certainly. So we
Absolutely.
will be keeping an eye out. It's November now, so the Black Friday deals are already starting to crop up. We'll keep an eye out for you, all of our audience. In the meantime, I've been Dynamo Ned. This has been TechForge. And remember, when life has you down, forge on.